Everyone knows how great Haymaker was in the base set only format. In fact, Haymaker was good all through the WotC era up until it was rotated. But what about the other decks that were available in base set only? And that's what we're going to be talking about today with this tier list of all of the decks that are at least worth mentioning. I mean, there are other decks available, but these are the ones that you're most likely going to encounter if you decide to play this format. Real quickly, I just want to talk about the actual tiers themselves and what they sort of mean. Obviously, it goes from top to bottom with BDIF. If you're unaware, if you're new to the Pokemon scene, BDIF is best deck in format. Not every format has a BDIF, but base set certainly does, which we will get to in just a little bit. Tier 1 is going to be either A in a format where there isn't a BDIF. Tier 1 is going to be where the best decks sit. If not, these are going to be the decks that are best suited for taking on the BDIF. Tier 2, this is sort of just the decks that are literally a step down from Tier 1, not quite as reliable or consistent, or maybe they don't hit those certain power numbers that you would really like to see, the certain damage thresholds. But Tier 2 is typically still a good place to be. Rogue is kind of a weird area as these decks aren't yet really getting bad, but they aren't necessarily decks that target a specific niche in the meta, or rather they don't specifically deal with any of the decks that are in the meta, and they sort of find their own niche and do their own thing, but they aren't necessarily decks that are going to be topping events, so to speak. Non-competitive, these are definitely decks that you will not see in the top 8, top 16, top 64, however big your tournament is. You won't see these decks at the top. These decks can still pick up wins, which is why they're not in the absolute bottom and absolute worst tier. Non-competitive decks are decks that are typically just fun, and honestly, I could have included a lot more decks in this list if I really wanted to fill out the non-competitive, but I just don't really think there were any others that were worth mentioning. But we'll get to the deck in here that I would say is non-competitive shortly. The trash tier is pretty self-explanatory. It doesn't matter whether you're playing with your friends. If you're playing with a bunch of noobs that have no idea what they're doing in Pokemon, chances are you're not picking up a win with a deck if it's in the trash tier. So with that out of the way, let's actually get into the decks and where they fit in this tier list. So as I mentioned, Haymaker is one of the best decks ever in the WotC era, and it does find itself as the best deck in format in the base set only format. And for many reasons, I mean, Haymaker, what it's known for is having big basics that do a decent amount of damage for a pretty low energy cost. And honestly, that set the tone for the Pokemon TCG for decades. I mean, we're still basically in a format where big basics that do high damage for low energy cost are going to be played. So Haymaker just does that, and it was the first deck to do so. And because it plays basics, it has more space for trainers to actually be able to, pull off the strategy and be more consistent, as well as being better at slowing down whatever it is your opponent's trying to do. Now, on the exact opposite end, we have Mulligan Mewtwo, which is a deck that just played 2 copies of Mewtwo, 58 copies of Psychic Energy. There was nothing else to the deck. You maximized your ability to find your Mewtwo, and you minimized the chance of finding anything else other than Psychic Energy after you set your first Mewtwo up. And the whole point of the deck was to get your opponent to mulligan a bunch of times, or to draw mulligans a bunch of times, and then you would deck them out. Terrible deck. It, for some reason, terrorized the web space, the blogs of this era. Everyone was talking about this deck, but this deck never topped an event. It never saw the light of day. I think it was just something that, because it was conceptually possible, people were scared of it. But the beautiful thing about a mulligan is you don't have to take the draws. So as soon as you see that first hand that they show you where it's all Psychic Energy, you're going to know what you're up against, and you can just choose not to draw, and then you can just shut down whatever they're doing. Now, there are, of course, the three iconic starters that we got in base set, and Rain Dance, which is the deck that features Blastoise and Gyarados, is actually one of the best decks in this format. It finds itself in Tier 1, not just because it was the only deck that could accelerate energy at the time, it also had its partner Pokemon Gyarados as its main attacker, and Gyarados resisted fighting, and fighting was one half of the Haymaker strategy. And you'll see that a lot, where decks that have an answer to Hitmonchan typically find themselves relatively high on the tier list, or in the meta ranking, however you want to say it. And Rain Dance certainly fits that, and because it can actually power up its Gyarados pretty quickly, it's definitely the best at countering Haymaker. The problem is that it requires a lot of setup in the first place, so if you don't get a good opening hand, you can find yourself falling short and just getting outpaced by Haymaker. And then we have Charizard, also known as Zardmaker or Haymaker Charizard, whatever. This deck I haven't seen this deck in any competitive tournaments, but I do think this deck has some merit to it. I've played against it a couple times, as James in the progression series. He tried running the Charizard, and we had done something similar before, and he played Charizard then as well. And whereas, obviously, in the progression series, I won against it, it also has beaten me before whenever we were playing base set only, and what it does is pretty cool. Charizard has a really good ability where it can just keep turning double colorless energy into fire energy, and since it's running the Haymaker package, it doesn't have to rely on the Charizard. It can outpace you with that as well. The unfortunate thing, and the reason why it falls so low and finds itself in the Rogue tier, is because it has to play the Charizard line, as that's the core of the deck. It means that you're more limited on either the number of Haymaker cards you're playing or the number of trainer cards you're playing. So it becomes a really tough balancing act of managing both sides of this deck. But if you can build a list that does so properly, this can be a meta threat. But since the only thing that it really does to interact with the meta is Charizard itself does resist fighting, but I think the number of games you'll find where you're actually able to get out the Charizard doesn't really reflect it being an answer to Haymaker. Now, the last of the starters that we need to talk about is Venusaur and its deck Venuscenter, which is a deck that focuses on, Pokemon Center and Venusaur. That's where the name comes from, but Pokemon Center is a card that just heals all of the damage counters on your Pokemon, and Venusaur has the ability, or the Pokepower Energy Trans, which allows you to move grass energy as often as you like during your turn from one Pokemon to another. And why this is important is because Pokemon Center does have the drawback of any of the Pokemon it heals, it discards all energy attached to them. So you can move your energy to a Pokemon that doesn't have damage counters and then heal all the rest, which is a pretty cool combo. But unfortunately, it doesn't really have great interaction with the meta, but it does have good matchups, which we'll get to later. So I'm going to put this in the tier 2. This is kind of a bias as well because Venusaur is one of my, or Bulbasaur rather, is my favorite starter and my favorite Pokemon of all time. But I do think that this is justified, as I'll show you later, but Venusaur does have some pretty important matchups. Moving on, we have the first of the damage swap decks. This is just pure damage swap, which it is Alakazam and its partner Gyarados. So Gyarados has a huge body of 100 HP, and then Alakazam has the Pokepower Damage Swap, which lets you move damage counters as often as you like during your turn from one Pokemon to another. And again, it runs the Pokemon Center, but this time instead of moving energy, you just move all of your damage counters to a Pokemon that doesn't have energy. So its main partner is Gyarados, but you typically also play one or two copies of Chansey in the deck, so you can build that up as well with damage counters and then heal it off with either a scoop up or a healing center. I think this deck does what Venusaur does, just a bit better, plus it has a more reliable attacker in Gyarados. The only real downside to this deck is the fact that Abra and Magikarp both have 30 HP. So it makes it very difficult if you can't get set up quickly. But if you can, this deck will give pretty much anything in the format a run for its money. On the other hand, we have Swap Strikes, which is damage swap, but with the partner Pokemon Machamp, which has the Pokepower Strikes Back, which whenever it is damaged by an attack from your opponent's defending Pokemon, its Pokepower does 10 damage to it. So it's sort of a way to keep damage going, since damage swap kind of struggles to keep damage rolling on your opponent. So this deck more focuses on getting knockouts, but the problem is that its partner Pokemon is now fighting, and if you'll notice, kind of a trend in the decks that are doing well, with the exception of Venusaur because bias and other reasons. But the decks that are doing well are either Haymaker or they resist Haymaker, and now you're playing a fighting Pokemon, and now you have to deal with all the Pokemon that resist a fighting Pokemon. And the other problem too is Damage Swap Gyarados has the benefit of a stage 2 line and a stage 1 line, so it's a little bit easier to set up. This is 2 stage 2 lines. And you only get 4 rare candy, or 4 Pokemon breeder in this case. So it's very difficult to set both Pokemon up reliably, and that brings it to the non-competitive tier. I don't really think this deck has any merit, but I do see this deck come up a lot in conversation, and I don't really think it's as good as people want it to be, but it's definitely not trash. I definitely think this deck can pick up wins. It's just case by case, and it's kind of a matter of roll the dice as to what your draws are and what your opponent's draws are. Now, the last of the major decks or the last of the major strategies, I should say, that we are bringing up here is the Buzzap archetypes, which, first off, I want to mention Buzzap Arcanine. This is a after the after fact, or after the afterthought is what I'm trying to say. The Buzzap strategy was something that was thought of after the fact, specifically with Buzzap or Buzzapdos, which is something we'll get to right after this. But Buzzap Arcanine is the other partner Pokemon that people have figured out is like the next best option, and it is a sort of budget option if you're going to play in paper, as Arcanine is only an uncommon, so you can typically find them for like under $5 in good condition, which you definitely cannot do with the Zapdos from base set. But this deck, particularly Buzzap Arcanine, does run into the problem of it doesn't really interact with the meta in any meaningful way. I think that both Growlithe and Arcanine are decent attackers, and it is faster at doing what Zapdos does. It also just doesn't really have any weakness or resistance points other than it is going to hit the Venusaur deck for weakness, but I'm going to put it in Rogue since really the only deck it interacts with is the Venusaur. And this is another reason why I put Venusaur in tier 2, because this actually wraps up our Rogue tier, and the two decks that are Rogue and don't really have any good matchups against the higher tier decks, or at least not any immediate game winning ones, or they both do hit Venusaur for weakness, but those are really Venusaur's only immediate bad matchups. Everything else it kind of has a neutral matchup or better against, and it also hits Gyarados for weakness, but I'm digressing. We'll get into that later. Buzzapdos, on the other hand, as opposed to Buzzap Arcanine, is actually a really good deck as far as its potential, because it's playing a stage 1 line and then a basic, which is pretty good. That's about where you want to be at as far as a aggressive deck, and this deck certainly gets aggressive. What makes this so good is you can set up a 60 damage attacker by your second turn. I mean, you need an electric energy attachment to Zapdos turn 1, and you need to have a Voltorb in play, and then turn 2 you need to evolve your Voltorb into Electrode and attach a second lightning energy to your Zapdos. That's still in the realm of possibility, and it's not a far-fetched combo. Like, you can definitely pull that off, and that's what makes this deck so good and better than Buzzap Arcanine. Also, Zapdos resists fighting, so again, that's a big part of this meta, is just being able to stop Hitmonchan from doing what it does. And then the very last deck that we want to talk about is Pure Stall. This probably isn't a deck that you'll ever see if you decide to start playing base set only format, but it is a deck that is around. There's a couple ways to play it too. I mean, the main star is Chansey, and you're probably not going to see many other Pokemon included in the list, maybe an Onix or any other big body basics, but some people play it without energy and just focus on trainers that are disruptive to what your opponent does. Or you can play it with energy and truly create a stalling wall with Chansey. But either way you play it, it's going to be about the same consistency as far as what you're able to do against other decks. And it's going to fall in tier 2 because unfortunately it does have a bad matchup against all of the fighting decks because Chansey's weak to fighting, so it turns a wall into just a 3-hit knockout typically. It is still a very good deck and has some good matchups against some of the other decks here, some that you might not expect. And that wraps it up for the tier list. But something else that I did and something else that I want to show you real quick is I actually made sort of a food web of all of the decks in base set. So this took me a while and this is a mess to look at, but first and foremost, you'll notice that Mewtwo is just kind of off on its own as it doesn't have any meaningful interaction with the meta at all. Every deck here is going to beat Mulligan Mewtwo, and Mulligan Mewtwo doesn't have any good matchups. Haymaker has a good matchup against Chansey, obviously. It also has a good matchup against Blastoise and Damage Swap, as well as the strike swap or swap strikes, whatever. But damage swap and the rain dance can certainly also have good matchups against Haymaker, which is why they have arrows going both ways. Those are all cases of it being sort of a coin toss as far as what your opening hands are and what your draws are throughout the game. Charizard's in the same boat where because it has its main attacker being a Pokemon that resists fighting, it definitely can go both ways, but I would say with Charizard, it's more than likely going to go in Haymaker's favor because the Charmander line isn't nearly as solid as you would want it to be in order to deal with Haymaker. And then Haymaker also has a good matchup against Buzzap Arcanine deck, as you can hit those Voltorbs for weakness really easily and get turn 1 knockouts, potentially winning on turn 1. Which the same can be said about Bazapdos, but I think Bazapdos is just better fit for dealing with Haymaker because more than likely you're going to start with a Zapdos since you typically play like 3 or 4 copies of it. Rain Dance obviously has a good matchup against both Bazap Arcanine and Charizard just for hitting weakness. It does also have a good matchup against the swap strikes because again its main attacker is a fighting and Gyarados resists it, so it becomes very difficult for this deck to actually do any damage, and you'll be able to outpace it and get rid of all of their scoop ups and Pokemon centers. Swap strikes also loses pretty hard to Bazapdos and the regular damage swap for the same reasons, just main attacker being a fighting resistor. And then damage swap has good matchups against both Charizard and Buzzap Arcanine, as again weaknesses. I mean, that's most of what this is just a weakness chart. There are a couple interesting ones. So obviously, again, Venusaur hits Blastoise and damage swap for weakness, and then loses pretty hard to Charizard and Buzzap Arcanine. And then, really, the most interesting one here is the fact that Chansey actually does a really good job of hard countering Buzzap Arcanine and Bazapdos because since the Chansey deck tends to play a ton of more trainers and like more trainers than anything else, it makes it so that you're more likely going to see your computer searches, your draw powers, your energy removals, and at the end of the day, that's what you're looking for is your energy removals when you're up against Bazap decks. Because if you can get rid of the electrodes, then they're going to be in a lot tougher of a situation. It's going to be harder for them to power up properly. It tends to be that Chansey can just out-resource the Bazap decks, and since there's not really a way to recover Pokemon, once you get rid of the electrodes off of the Arcanine or the Zapdos they're attached to, then it becomes much more difficult for them to make a comeback and scrape together a win. So you'll typically be able to stall out. That's pretty much the entire food web, the tier list, everything that there is to talk about here. I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope you learned something new about the format, and hopefully you can give it a shot if you haven't played this before. Personally, I love base set format. It's a lot of fun if you can get past all of the energy removal and disruption, but it is classic. It's where Pokemon started, so it's always a blast to return to it. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed. Let me know what you would have done different in the comments. Make your own tier list. Do whatever. Enjoy your day. Have a good one.